Okay. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully people have been able to join at the right time, and I'm sure there's going to be a few extra people joining us as we go. Welcome to our part two of our webinar discussions. This evening, the subject is reconciling with all our relations. I'm very pleased to have some great speakers tonight. Yeah, so for some of you, you joined us on Tuesday, and hopefully you came back to listen to some more. I find it a really enjoyable session. So some things you might have heard me say before, so apologize for that. There was a whole bunch of people today that hadn't joined those sessions, so welcome to you. I know some people that are joining, and yeah, it's good to, even though I can't see your faces, I can picture them, so that's great. So my name's Martin Tamlyn, and I manage the Old Growth Forest project at the Ignatius Jesuit Center in Guelph. The Old Growth Forest project is 100 acres of protected land right on the edge of the city, and with the help of the community and school children and people of all ages, that 100 acres is being loved and cared for and restored. It's one of the many wonderful things that happen at the Ignatius Jesuit Center, as far as community gardens, organic farms, and all sorts of other things. So I'd encourage you to visit us or visit our website and see what great things are up to. The Jesuit Center cultivates spiritual growth and ecological engagement, valuing creation, compassion, diversity, ecological sustainability, interfaith connections, social justice, and a life as a spiritual journey. We commit to deep truth and reconciliation, acknowledging these lands are the Anishinaabe, the neutral, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples. We honor and respect the land, the water, the plants, the animals, and the ancestors in the four directions. And we will continue to this deep spirit of gratitude for the sacred land we are speaking from today. The Centre also acknowledges the injustices perpetrated across Canada and commits to being part of that solution to bring social justice to the forefront of our daily works. As we go along, the things we talk about, Molly, my colleagues Molly and Patrick are kind of at the back end there. They'll be answering any questions and stuff and taking Q&As, but they'll also be popping in some links to the things that people are saying, and if you want any further information. So what we will be doing, we're providing links not only to the Jesuits, but also to the Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops official statements in response to the Church's participation in the residential school systems and their commitments to the process of reconciliation. So those links would be put in there. I want to start in gratitude and be grateful for this journey that I've been on in the last year. Grateful for the conversations, the new ways of learning, the relationships, and ultimately the friendships that have been formed during that time. I'm grateful to the Ontario Trillium Foundation that provided funding to make this opportunity possible, and also allowed us to kind of actually do some documentaries and videos and information stuff along the way, some of which we'll share, and you can find at the Ignatius Jesuit Center YouTube page as well. There's a whole bunch of good stuff on there. Yeah, I'm excited for our presenters tonight, Ellie, Clin, Dave Skene, and Maurice Switzer. Thank you for your time and for the work you do outside of these webinars. Now, just to kind of the program has taken a two-eyed seeing framework. Also, it's a movement towards braiding. I'll just explain that briefly. I know I did to others already. So a braiding is not taking two ways of seeing and kind of just combining them all. If you think of even a hair braid of like separate strands that remain separate and strong by themselves, but when woven together, make it even stronger. So that's how I personally perceive braiding. And from a two-eyed seeing framework, it's like a very holistic approach to caring for this land. And so with the one eye, seeing through indigenous ways of knowing and seeing, through the other eye, the Western scientific way of looking at the world, and kind of bringing those two, those pieces together in the judgments and the movements we make. Reconciliation is not about closing a sad chapter on Canada's past, but about opening new healing pathways that are forged in truth and justice. And that's straight from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I feel as though these talks have been those openings and those healing pathways. So I hope you feel that tonight. I am going to pass on to Molly to do a little bit of housekeeping, and then she will introduce the different presenters as we go through this evening's discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Martin, for that wonderful introduction. Just some housekeeping before we move on to our first speaker. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar for all 4 speakers tonight. So as they speak and as they finish their talks, if you think of questions you'd like to ask, we would just request that you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you do happen to put them in the chat, Patrick and myself are monitoring both, and we will write down what the questions as they come in order. Ideally, we'll have about 20 minutes for that Q&A session, but we will just go with whatever time we have left. So if we don't get to your question this evening, it's not that we're skipping you, it's just that we likely ran out of time. We do encourage these conversations to be continued following the webinar though. So please listen attentively, and I hope that you do learn something new. This webinar is also recorded, but your cameras and microphones are not on, so there should be no worries about you being recorded. We will make the recording available for you. Likely tomorrow, you'll get an email. That email will include the recording, all of the links that we're going to put into the chat this evening, anything that the speakers mentioned that you may want to look further into later, and a Google form. And the Google form is 2-part, one for your own reflection. So all of the questions are anonymous and optional. They'll just be to expand your thinking and also to help us understand what people gained or learned or started thinking about in a new way from this webinar. Since this is our second of 4, all of the questions are different than the past Google form that we sent out yesterday. So if you do have time following this webinar, please consider taking a look at that Google form. If you have any technical difficulties tonight, get kicked out of the webinar for whatever reason, you can email OGF, that's Old Growth Forest, _assistant@ignatiusguelph.ca, and we can put that into the chat so you can remember. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the evening, Ellie Clin. Ellie is an environmental educator by training and an adventurer at heart. She is a National Geographic certified teacher, a recipient of the Edward Bertinsky Award for Environmental Education, and a contributor to the 2nd edition of the Natural Curiosity Educator resource. In her current role as a program director and creative writer with Adventure Canada, she feels particularly lucky to get to travel within the beautiful lands, waters, and ice of Inuit Nunangut. These journeys have humbled and inspired her to learn more about the places she calls home. So Ellie, I'm going to pass on to you now.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thank you, Molly, for that introduction. As Molly said, my name is Ellie Clin, and it's a pleasure to get to share this space with you all tonight. I hope you don't mind, but I thought that rather than give a formal PowerPoint presentation, I would just share some thoughts and ideas with you. So I'll be a little talking head for you for the next little while. My family heritage is one of settlers from France, Ireland, Scotland, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. My mother's name is Madeline Clin, who was born in Welland, Ontario, near Niagara Falls. And my father's name is Bill Blackport, who was born in Lively, near Sudbury, Ontario. My maternal grandparents were Peggy Hefner of Toronto and Jean-Luc Clin of Quebec. My paternal grandparents were Marg Bolger of Cobalt, Ontario, and Jim Blackport of Saskatchewan. And today I'm speaking to you from my home in the city of Kitchener, which rests on the Haudenosaunee Tract, an area that encompasses 10 kilometers along each shore of the Grand River, all the way from its source to where it empties into Lake Erie. And this was promised by decree to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in thanks for their assistance to the British Crown during the American Revolution. But in fact, the room where I'm sitting right now is only about 3.5 kilometers away from the nearest bend of the Grand River. So all that to say, over the past few generations, my family has lived, farmed, worked, mined, and otherwise occupied Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Nihiawak, and Métis territories across a broad landscape of Turtle Island and what is today often called the country of Canada. And tonight I'd like to speak a little bit about what settlers such as myself can learn from the process of not just reading or listening to territorial acknowledgements, such as the one that I just said for you all, but also researching and writing them. I recently went through this process myself when I was writing a company territorial acknowledgement on behalf of my employer, Adventure Canada. And I wrote a personal reflection about my experience of doing that, which Martin read, and that's why he asked me to speak today. And I believe that the lovely Molly is going to put those links into the chat feature for you. So if you're interested in reading them now or in the future, they're there for you, but no pressure, obviously. Thanks, Molly and Patrick, for your behind the scenes help. So for anyone who's not aware or is perhaps confused about what I've been talking about so far, acknowledgements were not one of the 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, but they have become a popular way for organizations, governments, and institutions to show respect for Indigenous peoples, especially since settler Canadian society has started to become more aware of our shared history. And one quick note, in my travels north, I've learned that the Inuktitut name for Inuit homelands in Canada, which we call Inuit Nunangat, translates to the lands, waters, and ice of Inuit. So I've gotten into the habit of calling these territorial acknowledgements rather than land acknowledgements, which they're also sometimes called, because I've learned that land is not the only important concept in Indigenous definitions of homelands or territories. One thing I would, of course, really like to emphasize is that I am by no means an expert in this field. I don't wish to suggest that I can speak to this topic from an Indigenous perspective or tell you the right way of doing things. What I'll share tonight are only my own perspectives and my own experiences. And my intention is not to make this into a how-to session of sorts. But if you are interested in something like that, I took a workshop on writing territorial acknowledgements with a Squamish consulting company called Nahani Creative. I would highly recommend it. And so I believe that that link will also be in the chat for you if you'd like to look into it and take it yourself. Personally and professionally, I found that workshop a really important learning opportunity, and Tatalia Nahani's perspectives were very helpful and thoughtful when I was writing that acknowledgement myself. I know from my own experience of doing so that it was tempting to hire an Indigenous scholar or knowledge keeper to write our company's territorial acknowledgement. I was considering this because I very much wanted to make sure that I got it right or feel reassured that I had an expert doing the work and saying the words. And I don't want to necessarily say that you shouldn't do this. I would never want to suggest that we shouldn't hire and pay Indigenous folks for their expertise. But I think that if you want to publish an acknowledgement for the right reasons and not just for the show of having it on your website or saying it at the beginning of events, I think that there's actually a lot of value in settlers taking the time to research and write these acknowledgements ourselves. Part of the work of reconciliation is settlers engaging and grappling and struggling with our history and this work. Reading the treaties, learning how to spell and pronounce Indigenous names, finding out where the Indian residential schools were in your area and when they closed, learning which First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities are still nearby, becoming informed about what the most pressing modern day issues are for Indigenous folks in your area, figuring out which Indigenous-led organizations are operating in your region and what work they're doing. All of that learning goes into the writing of an acknowledgement. And I think that there's a different level of engagement and a different level of accountability that we'll feel when we study and learn these things for ourselves as settlers, instead of expecting or relying on Indigenous folks to teach them to us. So if creating an acknowledgement is something that you or your organization are thinking of doing, I personally would really encourage you to do the brunt of the work yourself. And if you're still concerned about things like accuracy or authenticity, you could always hire a knowledge keeper to review and provide feedback after you've created a first draft of your acknowledgement. So I thought we would talk a little bit about what an acknowledgement can look like. And this is the only time I think in my presentation that I'll share part of what I learned from Tatalia Nahanee's teachings, because I really don't want my words to fill in for hers. But one of the things that really stuck with me was that she said, the phrase, "I acknowledge you" or "I see you" is in fact very different from the sentiment behind a phrase like "I believe you" or "I'm grateful to you." And I've noticed that some acknowledgements are just that. They only acknowledge, and that's really as far as they go. I don't mean any disrespect, of course, to anyone who writes an acknowledgement like that. I think it is better than nothing. But personally, when I think about the territorial acknowledgements that I've heard or read myself, the most the most moving and meaningful ones to me are the ones that go beyond just naming the lands. I thought this evening's was a very beautiful one, for example. So I believe that there's going to be 3 more links coming into the chat for you now. And these are 3 acknowledgements, all from within Toronto, that I think give different examples of levels of thoughtfulness and integrity to the work of using an acknowledgement as a form of reconciliation. So you're welcome to open them up and read along with me if you like. The first is from the City of Toronto, and it says, "We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit." So this one, I would say, and perhaps you agree, is doing the work of acknowledging, which is wonderful, but I don't think it does much else to take us all into the next step. The second one is from the Toronto Public Library, and it says, "This library branch is on Indigenous land. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Six Nations Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Toronto Public Library gratefully acknowledges these Indigenous nations for their guardianship of this land. We'd also like to remind and affirm, as Torontonians and Canadians, our accountability to these Indigenous nations and to all Indigenous peoples and communities living in Toronto. This land is also part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, a treaty between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for this land, its waters, and all of the biodiversity of the Great Lakes region. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect." So this one I think is a beautiful improvement. Personally, I think it acknowledges, it expresses gratitude, and it reminds whoever's listening or reading of our shared responsibilities as treaty people. And the third one, which I will warn you is much lengthier, is from a Toronto writing studio called Firefly Creative Writing. And it was actually through this business that I first heard of Nahanni Creative. They also used their consultation in developing this acknowledgement. So I'll read it for you. We feel incredibly grateful to have a beautiful space in Toronto to do our work. And as we feel that gratitude, we also grapple with it. Our team is made up of settlers and their descendants here on this land as a result of a long and continued process of violence and colonization towards Indigenous people. We are committed to that grappling, to decolonizing our space and our processes, and to exploring ways to work in solidarity with Indigenous peoples who call this place home. We want to start by sharing the names of the Indigenous peoples whose land our studio stands on. These are the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Métis Nation. We also want to be clear that the treaties with European settlers aren't the first on this land. This territory was and still is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and allied nations to live in peace and cooperation on this land. The Toronto Purchase, also known as Treaty 13, which deeded this land from Indigenous peoples to Europeans, was and is unethical for all kinds of reasons. The amount of land claimed by Europeans exceeded the land in agreement. Communication about the nature of land ownership was ambiguous, and it's not clear whether Indigenous people actually signed the final contract or a blank contract that was later drawn up. And while we are remembering this heartbreaking chapter in our history, we also know that it's not history at all. Indigenous people in our community and beyond continue to face violence and obstacles placed by colonialism, including the Canadian government's attempts to assimilate Indigenous people into dominant culture, the racism that exists in Canada today, and even basic human rights issues like lack of clean water or affordable food. This wouldn't be complete without also acknowledging the resilience of Indigenous people, their cultures, languages, and communities. This is a historical and political climate filled with strength, survival, resilience, creativity, and power. Each season as a studio, we take action in solidarity with Indigenous initiatives in Canada. This fall, we are donating half the money coming in from our public events to Indigenous-run organizations, Art Cirque, and Indigenous Climate Action. If you are a settler on this land and you feel moved to take action towards reconciliation, there are some readings below to help you find your path. We strive to make our studio into a place where healing can occur, truths can be told, and hidden stories can be unearthed. We also strive to never take for granted the privilege and complexity of living and working on this land. Thoughts about this acknowledgement? Critique? Questions? We're here for it. We're still learning how to do this. We probably always will be. Drop us a line. We're listening. So one reason I thought this acknowledgement would be a good one to share with you is because Firefly has listed a number of really great learning resources there on that webpage, which I'd encourage you to explore if it's of interest to you. But besides the obvious difference in the word count of these acknowledgements, I think we can see that the sentiment behind each of these is different. Especially in this third one, I like that the context of the acknowledgement is firmly rooted in the present tense rather than in the past tense. It acknowledges not just the lands, but the complexity and historical context of the applying treaties. It also offers opportunities for further learning, for giving feedback, and it speaks to the actions of reconciliation that this company is engaging in. I've heard Martin call this before reconciliation. So each season they update their acknowledgement to include information about what they're doing in their community. This season it's a financial donation. I know in the past it's been things like offering free editing services to Indigenous graduate students in the city, or leading free writing workshops for Indigenous youth. I think I'm coming to the end of my time this evening, so I wanted to start wrapping up. But one idea that I wanted to end on actually comes from when I was still teaching in the classroom. And when my students and I were learning about an important topic, we often used the critical thinking framework of what, so what, and now what. And I'd encourage you, if you choose to write and share an acknowledgement, to do some similar thinking during your process. So as an example from my own life, the what, I've let you know that my home today rests on the Haudenosaunee Tract, an area encompassing 10 kilometers along each shore of the Grand River. So what? If I look at a map of the original Haudenosaunee Tract to give myself some context, I can see that today the community of 6 nations of the Grand River occupies only about 5% of the total Haudenosaunee Tract area. And I think another link is going to appear in your chat for you shortly, so that you can see that map yourself. So some questions I would have when I hear that are, what has happened in our shared history since the Haudenosaunee Treaty was drawn up that led to today's current land occupation? And what are the implications of that? I think that answering these questions would be really important learning to engage in during the process of writing an acknowledgement for anyone who's working within this territory. And the now what, the reconciliation. If you were occupying and working in the same territory that I am in, what could you or your organization commit to doing that shows its gratitude, respect, and commitment towards the work? Personally, I feel it's great to make this as personal and specific to your context as possible. Is there a special service, an amenity, a financial resource that you can offer in restitution? If your organization owns a facility space, for example, could you offer it to a local Indigenous organization to use rent-free? If you're part of an educational organization, is there a local residential school survivor society or a land-based educational program that you could support in some way? Personally, I feel that including details like these in your acknowledgement will both provide accountability and they'll inspire others who are reading or listening to your acknowledgement to take concrete action as well. So I think I'll wrap it up there. Chimigwech, Niawen, Marcy, Nakamik, for your open hearts and attention. And I'm really looking forward to hearing and learning from what the other speakers have to say this evening. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ellie. I'm speechless. That was very, very well said. I see a lot of thank yous as well in the chat for sharing these examples. And I think we all have some reading to do from this point forward. So I would like to introduce our second speaker of the evening, Dave. Dave Skene is Métis and a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. He is the executive director of White Owl Native Ancestry Association, a community-based Indigenous agency that has endeavored to enhance the lives of Indigenous people in the Wellington, Dufferin, and Waterloo regions since 1975. He is one of the founding members of, please excuse my pronunciation, and Dave, maybe you can correct me when I'm finished, Wissahickon, an urban Indigenous garden collective, and has been a grassroots educational innovator for over 30 years, leading numerous teams of Canadian youth on international education projects focused on justice and community development from an Indigenous perspective. His current focus is around issues of urban Indigenous and land sovereignty, Indigenous agricultural practices, and land-based education. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Dave. Thank you.
Wasak to Winawak. And Wasak to Winawak means it's a Saulteaux word from out west. It was a name given to the Métis people, and I liked it so much I wanted to use it in my work. And Wasak to Winawak basically means after a fire has gone through the land, the first green shoots that come up after that fire, that's Wasak to Winawak. So it gives the idea when the Saulteaux gave that name to the Métis of new life, new growth, new nation, new people, that kind of thing. A little introduction to myself. I'm Métis Scottish, Métis on my mom's side. My Métis family, their names, the names travel to the point where I am, are Brissette Minor on my mom's side, and Dussomme La Liberté on my mom's father's side. And they came originally from the Lesser Slave Lake area, and then eventually landed in Red River area, now Winnipeg, and then came to Penetangmachine, Ontario, where there was a small Métis community. My family eventually landed in Hamilton, Ontario, where I was born, mainly in their search for employment after, during and after the Second World War. Wholistic is a collective of Indigenous scholars and researchers and students and community members in the Waterloo-Wellington region, who've been asking the question, as urban Indigenous peoples, how do we live out our Indigenous responsibilities to the land in food and land sovereignty. And then White Owl Native Ancestry has been around for a long time, since 1975, and just recently, over the last 5 years, I would say, has started to really explore those same issues of land, land sovereignty and food sovereignty. And so, although I have lots of titles, in reality, I'm just a Métis farmer, which is what I try to do, stay out of the office and work on the land. My father came from Scotland, Aberdeen, Scotland. He was first generation to be born here in Canada. I identify myself more as Métis because I grew up in my granny's house, my Métis granny's house, and where my great-grandmother taught us the stories and as much as she knew about what it meant to be Métis as we grew up in Hamilton. I'm just going to make a statement. For us as Indigenous people, Métis people, and too, I just want to make a statement that as I'm sharing with you, I'm sharing from a Métis perspective. So I'm not sharing from for any other perspective than what I've been given over the years through those people who have invested in me and taught. So what I hope you hear is coming from my perspective as a Métis. But identity for Indigenous people is grounded in their relationship with the land, with their ancestors who have returned to the land, and with the future generations who will come into being on the land. And so for us, for my understanding, land is significant in many ways, but one of the most significant aspects for me in understanding my relationship with the land is that my ancestors came from this land, and have continued to live within this land and within me, and that's really significant. And then the other aspect is that in most things that I do, I spend a lot of time working with Indigenous youth in the area, and for me, that I want to give the opportunity for young people to explore the land, to begin to know the land, so that they can take an understanding of our land, of the land to the future. In my exploration with land, it's mainly been in a city. It's an urban exploration. And so we've been in many creative ways trying to explore what it means to live in the city, be Indigenous people in the city, and to continue to develop our identity and knowledge as land-based people. Another question we've been asking, how do we as urban Indigenous people bring our ancestors and our stories to the city? So the other thing that ties us to the land is stories. And so as we're kind of here in the city, we need to be creating new stories and develop and learning the old stories that are here within the city. And so that's one of the things I'm involved in, and I want to eventually get to a point where I can show you a really good story about some stuff that we're doing here. Another question we're asking is, what are our sacred and reciprocal responsibilities to the land in the urban context? So for us, it's not just the idea of like having land or possessing land, but it's the idea of how are we going to be responsible for the land that's here in the city? How are we as Indigenous people going to be responsible for land? And so we've been quite creative in answering that question too, and continuing to kind of figure that out. How can we as urban Indigenous people have a greater connection with the food we eat? Which I think is a question that a lot of urban people are asking, and is how do we really connect with our food, traditional food, and just food in general as we live in the city? So these are some of the questions we're asking. And I just want to tell a few stories of how we began to answer those questions over the years. One of the first things that happened as I began to kind of think about this idea of how I, as a Métis person, can live in the city and still draw so much of my life, identity, and story out of the land that was here. As I began to ask that question, one of the simplest ways to answer that question was to start a garden. And so I started a little garden up in Waterloo. I didn't have land myself to start a garden, but I started a little garden. It was a 10 by 10 plot. I didn't know anything about gardening, but I knew, well, I shouldn't say I didn't know anything. I knew 4 things. You needed to have a seed, you needed to have dirt, you needed to have sun, and you needed to have water. And with all that information, I went out and to this little 10 by 10 community garden and planted some things, and they grew. It was quite exciting. The next year, I got a few other people involved in this little project, and we had a 50 by 50 plot of land again up in Waterloo, and did the same thing. We planted some stuff, it grew, we were able to eat and harvest. We put in some medicines, so we were quite excited about this. As I'm doing this, I continue to meet Indigenous people who are also interested in the same thing. So we started talking and trying to look for more land to do this, and eventually that led to a number of different locations. Right now we're farming in 4 locations, one in Cambridge, one in Kitchener, one in Waterloo, and one in Guelph, where we're doing traditional foods that would have been grown in this area, but also just food, the food that we love to eat as well, and medicines and teas. And we share that with the Indigenous community here as we grow it. But I want to tell a quick story. In the process, as we were just getting involved with this, we here at White Owl, we got a phone call from a United Church up in Waterloo. And Michelle, who worked with me, she answered the call, and was the church wanted somebody to come and speak to a Sunday school class, Indigenous person to come speak to a Sunday school class, and then they were going to offer us a small donation that they'd been that they had for us. So Michelle took the call, and then she was just like, I don't really want to go to this church. Michelle was very anti-church, and she was kind of like, I don't really want to go. And as she said that, there was an elder here, and she said, the elder said to her, you should go, because you never know who's going to be an advocate for your work. And so Michelle went. It was really kind of a very simple thing. She spoke for like 3 minutes. They handed her a check, and then they were walking. One of the elders was walking her out to the door, and this church elder said, if there's anything we can do, any other thing that we can do for you as an organization, please let us know. And Michelle just blurted out, you could give us some land. And then the church elder goes, really? Some land? And Michelle says, yeah, like, you know, we would like some land. And so the church elder said, sit down here for a minute. He ran off, and he got another leader of the church, and they came out, and they told her this story, that in 1964, they had purchased 10.5 acres of land just outside the city that was now a part of the city. And in the 70s, it got environmentally protected. They had bought it to eventually build a church out there, but then the land got protected. And so they've been holding on to it for all this time, and really didn't know what to do with it. And so they said, maybe we could give it to you. And Michelle said, maybe you could. And so that started a year-long process of negotiating with lawyers and all that kind of stuff. And a little less than a year later, we exchanged a loonie for a rock from the land from the church people, and we ended up with 10.5 acres of land that's right here in the city. Over the last few years, we've been observing the land and speaking to the land and asking the land how the land would want to care for us. And so what we've been hearing is two things. The reason the land was protected is because it's a very small pocket of land that holds the Jefferson salamander. And so the Jefferson salamander is a species that's really at risk. And so it's being protected out there. I think there's 8 pockets in Southern Ontario, and this happens to be one of them. So one of the things we've been learning from the land is to our responsibility to look after the land, but also to look after the Jefferson salamander. And so we don't know anything about the Jefferson salamander, so we've been in a process of learning and trying to meet people who know more about the Jefferson than us, and going through a process of that. The other thing that we felt like the land had said to us as well was that for us to harvest maple syrup off the land. And so I think 4 or 5 years ago, I went out and put 5 taps into 5 maple trees, and for the first time in my life, I made maple syrup, and it was a great time cooking syrup in a big pot really slowly. And then the next year I did 15 trees, top 15 trees, and then kind of got the handle of it, bought a little better of a pot to boil on, so it didn't take so long. And then the third year I was working with a really close friend, Garrison, and we decided to go all out. We spent a bunch of money and bought a nice boiler, and we tapped 110 trees. And last year we tapped about 130 trees and shared that. We tapped the trees, we boil outside in the bush, and it's just an amazing time as we watch the winter, the cold subside, and the spring and the warmth come in. It's my favorite time of the year. I always say to people that there's maple syrup, the maple moon, and then the rest of the year is waiting for the maple moon to return. Anyway, so it's my favorite experience. But all that to say, like, as a group of Indigenous people living in the city, we have been given the opportunity to care and be responsible for a small parcel of land that is ours, which is pretty cool, I think, at this time. I just want to talk very quickly. The other aspect of us having access to land is also the idea of creating community. And I was taught the idea of community from a Métis perspective comes from the idea I've been taught comes from a word called Wholistic. And that word is connected to the Cree language or the Michif language. We say it's slightly different, spell it slightly different. But that word has the idea of kinship, and that kinship is includes all of life. So it's not exclusive to blood family, but kinship in the word Wholistic means that we share, we create community with all of life, and that the responsibility for all of life beyond human life is also to create community. So it's not just something humans create, but all of creation creates community. And I heard one of the elders speak, Métis elders, and say, Wholistic, the best way to capture it is the idea that there is a place for all life. Our responsibility as human beings, our responsibility as Métis people, is to create a place for all of life, a place for all of life to belong. And the reciprocal idea is that the rest of creation is creating a place for all of the rest of life to belong. And so we've been so that's been the way I understand my role in life, is to be involved in creating community. And it's my responsibility to continue to kind of find ways to include all of life in community. This summer, just to tell you another story, and I'm going to show a short video. But we had over the years, we've had a number of youth that have worked with us through the summer on our gardens, and sharing food and laboring with us, picking weeds mostly. And this year we got a small amount of funding to run the program with those youth that were working with us. And our focus, well, our focus before that we had this money, but we had a little bit, we had people who could actually spend time with the whole idea of how do we, asking the youth continually, how do we create community? How are we creating community with the land? How are we creating community with each other? How are we creating community with the food that we're growing? And so after a couple of months of that, of that discussion, we brought in a group that does spoken word, teaches spoken word, and does some photography. And we invited them in to help the students kind of work through in a very creative, intuitive way what their summer experience has been. And it was really cool. I was just this afternoon at Pearson Airport in Toronto, setting up a gallery. Pearson invited us to highlight the students' photography and their poetry in the art gallery right in the airport. So if you're flying through in Terminal 1, you can go by. The gallery will be up in the airport until the end of January. But while we were doing this, we also invited a filmmaker to come and do just a little filming to tell the story from the students' perspective of what their summer was like. And I'd just like to show you that film. I'll get it set up first here, hopefully. And then share screen. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, it looks good. All right, cool.
Every nation and every clan
The elders to a person, whether a woman or a man,
shared a common truth,
one truth to understand,
that the spirit of the people is equal to the spirit of the land.
It does kind of make me look a little bit differently at it because I don't know, I didn't really grow up too much in Indigenous communities, grew up seeing the world a lot of the way that everyone else kind of does too, but it was nice getting this kind of perspective more from, you know, what my ancestors, the way that they viewed the world.
Being able to learn all the things that I never really got to learn about my own culture and about Indigenous culture, and be able to take back the stuff that was taken away from me, including the knowledge.
We live outside of Nova Scotia and very far from our nation, so we aren't really connected, but work at the gardens and everything. I feel like I'm giving back, I'd say, to my people.
Talking about the land, Indigenous resurgence and revival, and kind of like a decolonized version of gardening.
Just seeing it is like something I planted, and then months later it's like it pops up and it's like, wow, like it's so beautiful to give life and to see it reciprocate.
It really made me think about like what I'm doing in the garden, like what am I connecting to in the garden?
It does make me look at nature in a new way. Now doing it with photography, it's like looking at the world through a different lens.
I learned more about the land and why Indigenous people care so much for it.
Lagos Indigenous Cross
I
am Mi'kmaq from
and I'm also Indigenous Black.
I learned that I'm an artist because I always thought like, oh, I'm not artistic, but then took up photography this week and poetry, so I guess I'd say I'm an artist.
I have more confidence in myself as a writer, I'd say.
It was really sentimental for me because
My grandfather gave me his camera before he passed away. It's really good to learn how to use it because I feel like I can carry on his passion of photography.
I didn't know I could do poetry like that before coming to this program.
Seeing those high quality photographs, looking at my eyes specifically, I'm like, wow, I have really piercing eyes in this one shot. It made me see myself in a new light.
I just always liked taking pictures of nature specifically, so I had so much fun.
I think I learned how to express myself a lot more. So when I was writing things, it was like, man, I feel like I'm talking to someone who just gets it. I was talking to me. I was finally telling myself, this is how I feel, knowing that I don't have to have like a beautiful regalia. I'm Indigenous, just being myself.
Future descendants, I'd want to pass on, or at least make sure that they know what I've learned, at least. With everything that I've learned, even just all the teachings that I've gotten, everything I've learned about the land, everything I've learned about relationships and our relationship with the land, I'd want to teach that to them and make sure that they know. Because I know sometimes with time, a lot of knowledge and stuff can sometimes disappear, especially Indigenous history. So I'd want to 100% make sure that they know what I've been able to reclaim and that I can pass that on.
I think I'd like them to kind of continue along, trying to keep their past in mind as well too. It's been kind of rewarding, kind of knowing a little bit of where you're from.
Keep doing art, inspire the world, change the world, do what you can.
You know, like, wow, this is my land. You know, and it's like I'm finally home.
The connected nature of nature, I guess, you know, or about cross-pollination and certain seeds that had to be planted a certain way before they even started to become what they actually are.
Like from the top?
All right.
So that was a group of youth we worked with this summer, getting to know the land in the city. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks for your time, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Dave. So if anyone does have questions, you can type them into the question box at the bottom. We're going to move on to our third speaker. I'm happy to welcome back Martin Tamlyn, who is a community builder and teacher focused on restoration ecology within a decolonized framework. Originally trained as an elementary school teacher, he has spent the last 20 years dedicated to climate change mitigation action. He has designed and led programs in environmental home building, forest gardening, permaculture design, sustainable farming, and ecology. He currently manages the Ignatius Old Growth Forest Project, where he facilitates community-led ecological restoration and nature connection programs. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Molly. I am going to share my screen. I got some nice photos to share with you. And there we go. So, there we go. So, from Elder Dr. Reg Crochu, Pickney First Nation, Alberta, said, reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians from an Aboriginal perspective also requires reconciliation with the natural world. If human beings resolve problems between themselves, but continue to destroy the natural world, then reconciliation remains incomplete. So in terms of reconciliation being making amends, writing relationships, it means also getting to know and explore and find out where those relationships have gone wrong. So this is a kind of a journey from my educational perspective, very much of a land-based approach. to healing our connections and healing the lands as we go. So the first part of that journey, and this, I've explored this as a teacher, is that kind of the originally that falling in love part. I look at my own self and realize how much I love the natural world, plants in particularly. And so when you love something, you tend to care for it. But if you, like Dave was saying, a lot of people these days are kind of urban based. A lot of indigenous people are urban based. And so that, you know, it's not an easy thing to do because, you know, for many people, you don't know any of the names of the plants. Nature is kind of just a green backdrop. And it's often because those values aren't attached to it, that the land is kind of abused and kind of not cared for or even noticed. So that first bit is falling in love. So a lot of it for me is that kind of a awakening, and sometimes you've got to kind of hold someone's hand and lead them in that. So this is kind of the what I call the beauty part. So I have lots of education activities that connect. And this is when I'm a lot of these photos are with kids I've worked with, but any age, when you're doing these activities, it brings people back to where they kind of, their childhood and the joys and kinship within childhood, but also just maybe even a deeper remembrance. So here we are as an activity. You get blindfolded and you just use to see with your hands, and you feel the textures of the trees and branches and all that kind of stuff. And then you're spun around and you have to kind of find which tree was yours. You kind of get led away. That's a really fun activity, and you get to know the names of the trees. There's a black cherry right here, and this one is a young girl just seeing it. All the other trilliums in the forest are white, and this red one, the wake robin, was this deep red. And it was just so wow. It was such a great discovery. This is a great activity. I also like to kind of like when you're using your senses, you can really kind of wake up the natural world, and even like give people different perspectives of it. So this is one of my favorite activities called Eye in the Sky. So basically it's some mirrors on a board. You stick it on your nose, you go for a walk, but because you're staring into the mirror, the entire world gets turned upside down, and you're walking through the canopies of the trees. So these kids are very gingerly walking along the boardwalk here, and just like screaming a little bit sometimes because they're kind of sometimes stepping off branches into the sky. This was a program, an activity called micro hikes, where the little kids would have magnifying glasses and wander through the meadows and follow kind of yarn that I've laid out in strings. It's kind of like a map, their little mini hike, but it's amazing what you find when you really look close. I love this picture, and look how tiny that flower is. You would never have seen it without this activity. This is fun. I like this girl in the middle. She's holding her nose. She's repulsed by the smell that we've been making. These are kind of called smell cocktails, where we gather, spruce and dirt and leaves and whatever, and you mix them together, and you're invited to a little party, and you give a name to them, and you share them with your friends at the smells. It really awakes their interest, and really a lot of our memories based in those smells as well. So I love that picture. This is where we're doing some creek studies. Do you get the impression these girls are happy here? Look at those smiles. You know, just playing in the water. Like, it's amazing how connected we are. So this is kind of that first part of that journey. Here we are, seed collecting, looking at the grey dogwood on there, and talking about all different ways we can kind of forecast and predict seed production for growing into other shrubs to plant in other places. Here's old Larry Halleck here. He was very much involved in some of the Old Growth Forest Project work. And so we do use the land as a demonstration area to show people what can be done. So this is where the old mill pond used to be, and where the dam was removed. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. The next part is the kind of the mystery part. So this is kind of like all of it's wrapped in awe and wonder when you really think about it. You think about this beautiful blue ball floating in the universe. But when you look at all the interconnections as well, your interest has been sparked now. So this is the white spruce, and this is a really cool tree to tell this story. And this is actually the tree I use telling this story. Is that you'll notice on the spruce trees and the conifers, and there are massed years, like years of high seed production. Now they don't do it every year because the squirrels they take everything, and they were out there chattering today when I was out walking. And so you'd never get a spruce tree again because they squirrel them all away, bury them up, and keep them for those winter months. So what this tree does very cleverly is doesn't give them very many seeds at all for a few years, keeps the squirrel population down, and then there's a mast year, where there's a big seed year. And I think it was like 3 years ago now, where this spruce was completely brown in cones. And so then that year, the squirrels are overwhelmed. They don't know what to do with it all. They hide it away because they know there's lean years coming. And then they forget, a bit like me, they forget where it all is. And then these spruce trees come up. So just like a little bit of the magic of how these interconnections and the relationship between animals and plants. I planted an elderberry bush, and it was the only one in the entire 100 acres. And within a day, these two turned up. I felt bad interrupting them. They're having a bit of kind of a private moment there, it seems, but it was, I'd never seen them before. They were huge and so beautiful and so large. And so I called my friend who was an entomologist and said, what are these things? And I just planted an elderberry bush, and much to my surprise, it was the elderberry borer beetle. Where they've come from, I don't know. They were just waiting for that invitation and to say, thank you for putting that in. We really needed that. And to see that interaction. So when we look at the interactions between the plants and the animals, it's so wonderful to see the role that the native plants have in those connections. All these insects grew up with these plants. So when you place native plants, then that's where the insects come to. That's where the birds come to, because it's food for them. So that the red oak is host to 500 different kinds of caterpillar. So I'm going to plant a red oak, a native oak, rather than one that's been an ornamental or an imported one. Now then, from there you move into knowledge. So this is all reconciling your relations, and you're actually making amends, right? So then we just, because we work with invasives, how the landscape has been colonized by introduced plants. When we're teaching community groups and volunteers, and this is managing common reed or Phragmites. So this is ways of solarizing it, not using chemicals, and with this, so we're instructing here. This was given instruction on how to do with the wonderful plant, the European buckthorn. But yeah, just using the tools that you need and the skills you need to kind of read the forest and identify plants and so forth. The next one is kind of, I'm going through this quickly because I'm aware of time. I'm really keen for Maurice to talk. But also is knowing the names of the plants. So this is the American beech here. And it's wonderful how this beech tree can then sends off these roots and all these little baby beeches popping up everywhere. It doesn't really usually do it by seed. And when you clear that buckthorn out, we've found them, we've liberated them and really helped them out. This one here, we're just measuring it. You're measuring the diameter at chest height. And then you can calculate by using the growth factor of like how fast a tree grows without having to cut a tree down. And in this case, it was 192 years old, I think. What was it like? So it was like started the growth like 18, 20 or 30 or something like that. Seen a few stories. It's so incredible. And here's prairie smoke. It hasn't quite opened up yet. It's a very gentle plant, but this is a native meadow and prairie plant. And here is an expert. After that knowledge and knowing how things work, it's actually the doing part, just like I said with that reconciliation, right? It's great to do this part, but let's heal these spaces. Let's create this biodiversity. Let's create this living network of things. And it's not like just planting an ornamental landscape in your garden, because that's, I mean, it's very pretty, but it's dead. When you plant a native landscape, then it actually comes alive with all the insects and the animals that are related to them. This is a group of kids from, I can't remember what high school in Guelph. A lot of the kids were newly immigrant kids to the country, and this is kind of their first school trip. And we're planting there. Like, I took this picture today. It doesn't give it justice because there's so many different colors, but that was just there's white pines and there's oaks and there's all sorts of stuff, and there's just such a transformation in just a couple of years. Here's the pond at Ignatius. There's a perfect example of reconciliation where this was dammed in the early settlement to run a sawmill to clear the land of lumber and sell it. This heats up, captures all the nutrients from all the farms because all the forests have been taken out, feeds in really hot water to the rivers and then into the lakes, and those nutrients will then cause algae blooms. So basically, it's a mini version of Lake Erie, which it actually empties into eventually. Now, what you think with that is, you can really change this, because we're going to pull the plug on this and bring the life back in it. And there's so many I think on the Credit River watershed, there's 600 mill ponds that aren't being used anymore. There's no water mills anymore, and they need to be taken out because of feeding hot water and these nutrients into the streams. And so then we pulled a plug. There you go, and we found the stream again. It was in there all the whole time. It was awesome. Been liberated. That was a year later. I can't believe the dynamics of a creek system. It's so incredible. Here is it even further on. There's mature trees. And what's nice about this, and I'll finish with, there's other work to be done. We use Christmas trees from the city to stabilize the banks and create fish habitats. This is an invasive Scots pine we take down and make bundles in which sediment can be collected and form on those banks as well, and give places which kind of clear the stream out and leave gravel for the fish to come in and spawn and lay their eggs. Such a great process. And here we are kind of really shaping that river. And again, these are Christmas trees from Guelph. And then with that, they hadn't been there since 1832. It was a cold water creek again. This is actually the Northern Creek. There's a gravel bottom again. And there they are, the brook trout that haven't been in that part of the creek. There was a small population right at the very top. There was a nice ground-fed system up there. The creek, and this is right on the edge of the city. You can even almost see Walmart and Canadian Tire from this bit of land. In the latest studies 2 weeks ago, there was 24 species of fish found in the Marden Creek. Oh, amazes me. And here we are, species at risk, part of our work as well. So the plants that really, and animals that really need our help. Here I am planting a butternut. Here we are planting meadows with our volunteers. And these are actually plants that weren't planted by them. They took grade 4 students maybe 3 years ago before COVID hit, and I ran out of all my volunteers. But this is the beard tongue foxglove. Such a beautiful plant. I'd never seen these things before. We don't ever see them, you know. There's so many naturalized plants. So we're just kind of bringing those plants back, and there's insects that are like, yay, thank you so much. This is the Michigan lily. Such a great place. I guess I didn't have my glasses on. I was hoping for a Virginia mountain mint, but it looks like a yarrow to me. And then there's the spike blazing star as well. Such beauty. Here we are, the retired meadows of the Old Growth Forest Project, Oldfield Meadows. And that was it. That was only 5 years ago. It was all meadows. And then as we went along, we kept planting more and more trees, about 10,000 so far, actually, in fact, and shrubs. And then that's what it looks like. It looks like this summer. And then these trees are over my head and producing seed already. You know, I was quite humbled by this project, thinking I'll never see the results of my actions or collective action. But there it is right in front of us. And then finishing, there's an onlooker there, also very grateful, I think, but I hope they don't come and nibble my trees. So there, there's that journey I've taken you through. So it was like the here I am again. That journey of kind of falling in love, holding people's hands, finding out how it all works, what I can do to help it, what skills I need to do to help it, then actually doing the work. And that to me is like true reconciliation for the land. Okay, thank you. Over to you, Molly.
Thanks, Martin. That was great to see all those pictures. So it is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker of the evening, Maurice Switzer. He is a citizen of the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nations. He has served as an Ontario Human Rights Commissioner, publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press, communications director for the Assembly of First Nations and Union of Ontario Indians, an adjunct professor of Indigenous Studies and Communications on the Laurentian University campus. He lives in North Bay, where he is currently chair of Nipissing University's Indigenous Council on Education and president of the North Bay Indigenous Friendship Center. So welcome, Maurice. I'm going to pass this over to you.
Miigwech, Molly. I'll thank you, Pat. I'll introduce myself in the language in Anishinaabe. Anibo Jobanese, Dishnakas, Wajesh, Dodamana Schnabek, and Guaro Dodam Haudenosaunee. Alderville Dunjiba, North Bay, Indiana, and Schnabek, and Dow. So I've greeted you. I've said that a name I've been given is Benesi, which is short for Nimki Benesi. type of bird. I've said that I have two clans, Michi-Sagig, through my grandfather Moses Muskrat Marston, who was the chief of the Mississaugas of Alderville in the early years of the 20th century, and through my great grandmother Esther Hill from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, I have a Wolf clan. And I said that I live in North Bay. I'm speaking to you right now from the from Anishinaabe lands, and our closest First Nation are the Ojibways of Nipissing First Nation. And I said we're part of the Anishinaabe Nation, and I thank very much Martin for the invitation, and I actually have been in the Ignatius Jesuit Center, I think at least twice, sharing information with two different school boards, I think, in your area about treaties. I spent a lot of my time sharing information about treaties because there wouldn't be a Canada without treaties. And I want to thank Ellie for talking about the importance of land acknowledgements, and for emphasizing that it's not Indigenous peoples who should be writing land acknowledgements. We know whose land this is. That work should be done by non-Indigenous peoples. They can always ask Indigenous helpers to, to vet their, their finished products. I want to thank Martin for talking about the importance of showing particularly young people, but a lot of urban people, how to bring life back to to our nature, our natural settings. And Dave just oozes love of of the land. And one of the myths about Indigenous peoples is that we were these nomads, traipsing around North America in loincloths with spears in our hands, waiting for animals to kill. We were the world's first agronomists. Indigenous peoples of the Americas were the first people to cultivate corn, rice, potatoes, tomatoes. We have literally, because of our culture of sharing, we have fed the world, and didn't put patents on all of those gifts that we were given by the Creator and that we have shared. I think since we were talking about the land, it's important for people to understand how the situation in this country called Canada went from one in which Indigenous peoples were the only occupants of this land. And as the land acknowledgements like to say, we were stewarding it and guarding it and looking after it, to a situation today where we are just in a minority of people living on this land, and all of our connections to the land, legal and otherwise, have largely been severed. And that's an important part of Canada's history that every Canadian needs to know and understand. Not because we want to dwell on the past, because we want Canada's future to be a lot better than its past. This teaching is a medicine wheel teaching. You can talk for days about what you see on your screen, but this teaching basically gives the message that the Creator, when he sent the first person to this place we call Earth, gave that person 4 gifts that were symbolized by plants, trees, animals, and the rocks. And those gifts symbolized respect, honesty, sharing, and strength. And the Creator said, that's all you will need, to thrive on this earth that you're going to. The next slide. And I want to thank Patrick Kelly for excerpting some slides from my normal treaty presentations to share with you. Here's a sugar bush, Dave. This is an artist depiction of a sugar bush, and you can see a European wielding an axe there, and And again, as long as they came in peace, the indigenous peoples across this land welcomed newcomers and shared their knowledge with them. Otherwise, they would have starved to death or frozen to death in environments that were completely different. And you could see they didn't have metal pots. You can see there's a wooden pot, they often collected in birch bark baskets. And it's important because when we talk about treaties, we talk about nations, and it was the Europeans who decided that better to be show discretion when coming to this land, because they saw how fiercely the Indian warriors defended their lands, and they were the ones that asked for treaties, and they recognized the indigenous peoples as nations. The mightiest European empire that ever existed, the British Empire, recognized in the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that the Indian tribes of North America were nations. And there's a wonderful Nihilwak lawyer named Sharon Venn from out west, who I've heard her speak, and she talks about what the Indian, and I'm using that word in its historic sense, the Indian nations in what's now Canada, what were they like? And well, they had their own language. These are the definitions, the criteria for nationhood. They had their own language, they had their own laws, they had their own belief systems, they had their own arts, culture, they had their own justice systems, they had their own governance systems, and they had their own lands. They were the only people on these lands for thousands of years. So Sharon asked Canadians to look at Canada and ask, does Canada have its own language? No. Does Canada have its own law system? No. Does Canada have its own belief system? No. Does Canada have its own systems of governance? No. Does Canada have its own arts and culture? No. Does Canada have its own justice system? No. Does Canada have its own land? No. Is Canada a nation or a colonizing state? That's a good question, and it's one that I wish all students, all Canadians discussed and debated in school. It says a lot about this country's history. Next, thank Patrick. Next slide. Before we talk about how the land occupation and sovereignty and title transferred, everyone needs to be aware that the mightiest belief system that ever thrived in Europe, the Catholic Church, Christianity, that was very much propped up the crowned heads of Europe, that they provided justification for all of the colonization that took place around the world, including in North America. And Canada and the United States began as colonies. Some people say that Canada is still a colony. There's no such thing as post-colonialism, that Canada for Indigenous peoples is still being colonized. And the papal bulls that were issued, beginning with the first one, I think in 1455 by Pope Benedict V, basically said that if the voyages of exploration that originated in Europe and most of the major nations in Europe, Spain, Italy, France, England at the time, if they anywhere in their travels around the world, if they came upon lands where the people did not believe what they believed, in other words, if they weren't Christian or specifically Catholic, that those lands were considered empty. They were considered in Latin terra nullius, and they were open for occupation. In many cases around the world, that meant military occupation, taking by force the lands and their resources. It didn't happen in Canada because, as I said, the Europeans, first the French and then the English, quickly understood how fiercely the Indians defended their land here, and they decided they better resort to diplomacy. Next slide, Patrick. contrary to that doctrine of that declared that those lands were empty, you can see that there's not much empty space in what we call Turtle Island, North America. There were hundreds, and there still are hundreds of nations of indigenous peoples all across the continent. No empty land there. Next, Patrick. So the treaty process that literally began at Niagara the year after the Royal Proclamation in the summer of 1764, we've depicted in this book the representative of the King, Sir William Johnson, who is the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for British North America, which in 1764 was the colonies started in Canada and the United States, promised those an estimated 3,000 Indian leaders and chiefs and headmen near Niagara Falls at Fort Niagara, that over the course of a month in dozens of council fires, he gave wampum belts and made promises that his diary reports said, if you take up this belt with the English, your people will never be poor as long as the sun shines, as long as the rivers run, as long as the grass grows, and as long as the British wear red coats. Our artist, Charlie Hebert from Doquis First Nation up here, we asked him if he would make Sir William Johnson stand out, so he put yellow hair on him. He almost certainly had a gray powdered wig, but we wanted him to stand out in this image. That's how the treaty process started, because all the settlers asked was that they have the right to share the lands. And after their many promises that included 30,000 gifts and 6,000 British pounds sterling, the equivalent of $20 million today, and a promise that the entire center of the continent between the 13 colonies and Spanish territories in the west of the continent, that would be exclusive Indian territory. No settlers would be allowed west of the Appalachians. For those promises and those gifts, those chiefs agreed, and that became the foundation of what 103 years later became a confederated Canada. Next slide. Every square inch of this province is under treaty. There's so many treaties in Southern Ontario that you can't fit them in, all the words in this slide. Every square inch and all the promises from across the country to the numbered treaties out west were all very similar. They made promises that about in exchange for sharing the land, that they would, for example, one of the promises was, we'll always provide your people with a medicine chest. That's healthcare. We will always provide your people with a schoolhouse. That's education. Every treaty promise that's made has been violated. Every single one. This country, unfortunately, has a foundation. As much as we love to live here, it has a foundation of false promises, broken promises. Reconciliation is about trying to do something, to remedy those promises, and especially dealing with the land. Canada's Parliament buildings sit on land that have never been. They are not the result of any Indigenous people being conquered, and they are not the result of immigrants ever compensating Indigenous peoples for those lands. Next slide. One of the differences between Indian treaties and the treaties that we know, for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement or the global climate treaties, one of the big differences is they are more than legal contracts, which they are. They were sacred agreements that involved ceremony, and here is showing smoking a pipe, which is sharing a pipe and smoking that sacred tobacco. Sema was just as meaningful to the Indians as today. If those settlers went into a courtroom and put their hand on a Bible and said, I promise I'm telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. Next slide. to see how the treaty process, which started as long as the Indians greatly outnumbered the settlers, the relationship seemed to be fairly positive. But as soon as the number of settlers greatly outnumbered the Indians, then they felt much more comfortable in breaking promises. And the treaties, instead of being gestures of friendship and peace, became duplicitous attempts to get land away from the Indians. And they had to rely on translators. This is a treaty involving my community, Alderville, in southern Ontario. And there are words in there like cede, meaning like CEDE, surrender. The Indians were never told that they were doing anything but sharing the land. Certainly not selling it or surrendering it or seeing it. Why on earth would anybody give up the land from which they derived all their sustenance? That's like you living in a community where there's only one grocery store and agreeing to sell it to your neighboring community and giving up your food source. Why would they do that? And the next slide shows that the so-called signatories, and I never use the term signatory to refer to Indians whose name is on treaties, because they couldn't read English or write English. They accepted the translated words that have so often, almost every case, been shown to be downright untrue, which is why most treaties end up in court, including the Williams Treaty, which was resolved in 2018, and of which my community, Alderville, was one of the participating First Nations. I see there's a concern about the time. I'm doing the best with the time I was allotted. I apologize if we're going over. You can see the names that are on the left of the chiefs. They're written in one hand. That would have been a treaty clerk. The Indian chiefs, leaders, would have drawn their clan symbol. There were hoof clans there, bird clans. My clan, one of which is muskrat, Wajush. That might be a muskrat at the bottom there. It looks like it could be, or it might be a beaver or an otter. So it was through this process that much of Canada's, almost all of Canada's land base changed hands. Okay, next slide. This is a difference in worldviews. If you wonder why many Indigenous peoples don't want statues to Sir Johnny Macdonald or schools or buildings with his name on them, this is the attitude that he had after he became Prime Minister. They wanted to just get the land away from the Indians. In the House of Commons, he talked about, he used words like savage and half-breeds, and he actually in the House of Commons talked about a deliberate government policy to starve, to withhold rations from the Indians of the prairies, to get them onto reservations, onto reserves, and to sign treaties. Again, one of the reasons that many of those treaties ended up in courts is because of the duplicitous manner in which they were brought into being. And on the other hand, you see a Mississauga chief from your part of the country who in very poignant and flowery language said that the British, people like Johnny Macdonald, came across the Great Lake, that's the Atlantic Ocean, and the Indigenous peoples welcomed them and nursed them like young trees, like the trees that Martin and his students plant. We protected you until you became a mighty tree, and then you lashed us with your branches. Next slide. The Indian Act was soon brought into effect when the official government policy was started to be to assimilate Indians and literally make our culture disappear. That's the attitude. A person means an individual other than an Indian. Next slide. The worst part of the of the Indian Act, of course, I don't need to tell you, I don't think at this point in time, about residential schools, but literally policies designed to quote one government official, to kill the Indian and the child. And the impacts of that are still being felt today. I was talking earlier today to a group of educators some people wonder why Indigenous peoples aren't so open about their children receiving education. And I said, how would you feel if you sent your child to school today and you never knew if they were going to come back alive? How would you feel about that? Next slide, please. From occupying 100% of what is now Canada, those little red dots are reserves, over 600 of them. They constitute 0.02% of Canada's landmass. That's the only land that you can really call Indian land anymore. And that land is not, if you live on a reserve, as about 30%, about a third of Canada's, the First Nations people who live in Canada do, you don't even own the land under your home. That's held in trust by the federal government, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. Next slide. What's happened with the treaty process, instead of sharing the wealth of this country, even our treaty rights that we were promised, the rights to hunt and fish as we always had to feed ourselves, are being challenged right up until today on the shores of lobster fisheries in the Maritimes, despite the Treaty of 1752, despite that treaty being upheld by the Supreme Court in 1999. Mi'kmaq fishers are being beaten on the docks. Their boats are being burned by non-Indigenous fishers who don't know anything about the treaty process, and they probably don't even care. They just they don't understand what the rule of law is in their own country. Canada's treaties are protected in Section 35 of the highest law of the land, Canada's Constitution. Section 35, subsection 1, constantly being upheld in court decisions. The only people who are really leading this reconciliation process in Canada are teachers. Our politicians who are supposed to lead societal change are bringing up the rear. The courts are ahead of them, and educators are left with the chore of explaining why Canada's political leaders for this country's 154-year history engaged in fraud, in land theft, and in crimes against nature and against humanity. So I'm so glad that there are people like Dave and Martin and Ellie who are involved in education, who are helping create more awareness about what's really happened in Canada. Next slide. So we're back where we started. And again, if Canada is going to be the country that it can be, it's going to have to start using those gifts that the Creator gave us: respect, honesty, sharing, and strength in dealing with everybody who lives here, from the people who've been here the longest to the newest immigrants who come here. And they're going to have to start using those gifts in the way that they were intended, and to ensure that Canada is really the best country in the world that it often claims it can be. So again, I thank you for your time, for the invitation, and I hope there's time for questions. I look forward to it. Miigwech, thanks.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Ellie. I'm going to hand over to Patrick. I don't think you've seen him yet. He has been there the whole time. I'm not sure. I think there's been some maybe some questions coming in, or reflections that even maybe some of the presenters this evening have had. Yeah, I've been very moved this evening. I feel so grateful for this sharing. Patrick, hi. Over to you.
Thanks, Martin. And yeah, just to echo Martin, thank you so much to all of our presenters. This has been powerful and wide-ranging. So I just also, just like Maurice put into the chat, I want to acknowledge that we are going over time right now. Anybody that has to leave, including our presenters, please feel free to do so. And like everything that we're going to run through right now will be recorded. All of our presenters, if you're able, could you please turn your cameras on now? We'll just get into a few questions. So first up, also, if anyone wants to add more questions, feel free to click on the Q&A and submit some. We probably won't get to everything, but we'll try to get a nice range of questions here. So the first one that I see is, where can we find out what specific trees cover a specific area, for instance, Guelph?
Unfortunately, because the provincial, and thanks for that question, because the province of Ontario, has refused to follow some of the recommendations of the Ipperwash inquiry report that investigated the shooting death by a provincial policeman on September 6, 1995 of unarmed Chippewa protester Dudley George. One of the recommendations was that Ontario, the federal and provincial governments start creating a treaty commission, which several other provinces in Canada have, and that hasn't been done. And that's a way to, in other provinces like Manitoba and British Columbia and Saskatchewan, their treaty commissioners do a lot of public education and they work directly with school boards. So in Ontario, that education has been left to, in some cases, political organizations like ones I've worked for, or individuals like myself who work with school boards, including in your area. But you can, fortunately, you can find out either on the Government of Canada's website or in different organizations. You can even Google now, but you can get a list from the Government of Canada website of all the treaties. But it's amazing with the internet how much you can find. And again, in your area, the Upper Grand School Board and their Indigenous education lead, Clin, is someone I've worked with a lot, and she can direct you to anybody to a lot of resources, because the list of resources is really, thank goodness, it's growing considerably. So thanks, Brad.
Thank you, Maurice. Does anyone else have anything they want to add to that? Nope. All right. So this one goes to Dave. So how would one work on coming to understand the land and develop an identity that includes it, particularly if you're not much of a gardener?
Good question. There's no answer that's not a long answer. I think it's like anything that we have a relationship with. There is that reciprocal, there's a reciprocity that has to happen between us and the land. And I think, like in any relationship, there's the idea of what we experience as a community. So your community in relationship to the land. And then there's the idea of what we experience as individuals. And I think like part of it is kind of like what Martin was talking about, like getting to know names and the tactile idea of touching, smelling, feeling. But then there's the other intuitive aspects of communication, and which is very difficult to talk to people about, non-Indigenous people about, because it in some ways is a bit of a foreign concept. But in reciprocity, we care for the land, but our expectation is that the land cares for us as well. So there's this whole reciprocal idea. So what I do with students often is get them to begin to explore ideas of communication with the land. What does that look like? So a little beyond the tactile idea, but trying to discover some intuitive ideas of connecting with the land. And art, we found, has been like a very significant aspect of engaging intuitively with the land around us.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Martin, would you like to speak on that as well?
Yeah, just a little bit. I think one of the things that's really important is that there's no arrival point, and you're kind on yourself. As you revisit the garden every year, you come back to it with some more knowledge, and you come back to it with one extra year of observation. So it's kind of like a spiral, really. Another important part, I mean, getting to know names is a really good thing. Seeing everything as animate rather than inanimate, seeing everything having life. So when I see a new plant, I kind of say, "Oh, who are you? What's your role in this?" You know, I kind of giggle at myself and that conversation I have. But then there's lots of resources to understand. I mean, I don't know any Anishinaabe names of plants which relate, you know, directly to their relationship in the environment, the relationship with plants and animals. But there's other great resources. That kind of was part of my beginning journeys as well. There's an organization called Plants for a Future, which is a database of actually many of the world's plants. And you type in Latin or common names into there, and it gives you all the medicinal and edible, and it ranks, you know, like, you know, things that you might know in the garden. And it actually gets to know more just past the name. It actually tells a narrative of that plant. And that's also easy to remember once you have a narrative. So that's how I kind of begin that engagement with the land.
Thanks, Martin. Ellie, do you have anything you'd like to say on this?
I think it's as you know, as somebody who loves the place that I live, it can feel a bit of a strange sensation, perhaps, to know that I'm a visitor on the land, and that the land, even though I might feel a strong kinship with a certain region, it's not my ancestral homeland. But I think that I've come to recognize that even if I'm not living on my ancestral homelands where my ancestors are from, that I can care and love the land and take care of it in a way that I would want to do for my own ancestral homeland. So just trying to not feel like this is mine, but care for it as if it were mine, is a shift in my thinking that I've tried to do over the years.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And then Maurice, I'm gonna extend this question a little for you, because you were talking about treaties and understanding our history. So in addition, potentially to that first question, how would a connection to and an understanding of history and treaty help to inform our ability to care for the land and reconcile with all our relations?
Well, I think, you know, I know that some people, some indigenous people, I think they're fanciful in suggesting that, for example, there were treaty promises that to the extent that the Europeans would, you know, would become conservationists or whatever. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking there, but I think it's fair to say, from what I have learned, that the Indians, the historic term, would never have imagined that any human being would not treat the land with the respect that they had shown for thousands of years. I think that was beyond their understanding, that, you know, they had relied, you know, any peoples that have relied on nature to exist for thousands and thousands of years, and learn from the land and learn the medicines, thousands of medicine plants and as I said before, the foods. They couldn't imagine that anybody would treat the land as a commodity. And from the time Europeans came here, you know, after they got over their initial stage fright, you know, from, you know, and from which they were rescued by most Indigenous peoples, they began to start practicing the same commodification to nature that was going on in Europe. And you know, trees became sellable resources. They started finding wealth in minerals, and of course the fur trade. And that really disrupted Indigenous peoples who had believed in a sharing mentality, and the idea that somehow you would you know, in any way damage, you know, the very planet on which, you know, you depended. That was just something I just think they could never understand. And again, the treaties, there are different treaties that sort of come close to the wording that's handed down to us, comes close to this idea of sharing. And one thing that was quite common was that the Indians understood that they would always be able to enjoy their way of life as they had before the Europeans came. And that meant looking after the land. So.
Yeah, just a quick thing to add to that. In my own journey, just much like Ellie's looking into all these, doing her own research and trying to figure it all out. I knew that being in Ontario, it meant I also was a treaty person and I had obligations. And I wanted to understand what those obligations were. Now, when I started looking at the kind of the treaties, because there was so many in Southern Ontario, a lot of things I came across are actually more purchase agreements, and there was nothing in there for the Indigenous population at all. So I was looking for guidance in there to say, this is the way you should be. This is, you know, this is the agreements you made. So there were, from my understanding, Maurice, you might correct me on this, there was these overarching treaties that talked more of relationship regarding, like, say, the dish in one spoon or a two-row wampum in the way we conducted our business, which kind of, and even the Niagara Treaty, you know, kind of guided our actions a bit more. Because when I look locally for what my local treaty was, I mean, I think I'm the land between the lakes purchaser, where I am in Drayton. There was nothing of that in there. It was just like that language that you were referring to of like, surrender this, take this, do that, and all the occurrences. Like that was a new word, and I found it in Old English. Everything, not only the land, and everything that belonged to it, everything that I found on that land. So it was kind of yeah. I'm saying if people are searching for that, just to know that they're where to find those differences.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Martin, that the big treaties, the ones that have that were, and the Treaty of Niagara was really the you know, the grandfather of all treaties, and it was to reinforce the principles of the previous year's Royal Proclamation that said the Indian tribes of North America are nations, and that they have sovereignty in their land, and that the settlers would guarantee, the settler governments would guarantee that settlers didn't, the word they used was molest them in their lands. So again, it was those big agreements when when the Europeans were outnumbered, they were very humble, and they would have agreed to anything, because they saw from 500 years earlier, when the Vikings came plundering here and were scared back home by people they called Skraelings, who were probably Inuit or Innu people. Europeans understood that these people protected their land. That was the source of their life, the land and the water. They weren't going to give that up for anybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ellie or Dave, do you have anything you want to add to this? No? Dave?
Yeah, I heard Isaac Murdoch speak one time, and he used, I'm never going to get the language right, but because I only heard it once, but a word, Acknowledgements, I believe it is. And the idea of that word in Anishinaabe is the idea of creating an alliance with the land. So it's kind of like our responsibility to the land as humans, and the agreements that we make with the land as humans to the land, to the waters, to the air, to the animals and everything else. And that it's actually a sacred reciprocal agreement of responsibility between the Anishinaabe peoples and the land, and how they will live together. And I think like in my understanding, like often that's something that is missing in our relationship with the land, is that we as humans are meant to be have agreements or treaties, or acknowledge our responsibilities together of how we will live on the land in relationship with each other, beyond just human, but how we will live with each other, including all of life.
Yeah, I think the word you're looking for, Dave, is Naknagewin, which is law. And when I referred earlier to Indigenous peoples had their own system of laws, they didn't have to borrow anybody else's. It's, they understood, and their rules of life, their laws included respecting nature, only taking what you need, sharing, and reciprocating. When you took something from nature, whether you were picking berries or killing a moose, there was a ceremony involved in that. It could be laying down tobacco. I think the discussion has been made problematic by people who, with all good intentions, talk about having treaties with the land. That's really confusing, and I think with the best of intentions is somewhat misguided. But Indigenous law always was very clear, that looking after the earth, was part of of life, and even modern people who adhere to, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or, most holy books that I've encountered, they make it very clear that the last creatures, the last living things that appeared on this planet were human beings. And that's supposed to teach us humility, because if we disappeared tomorrow, it wouldn't hurt anybody else. Everything would all of a sudden become a lot healthier than they are right now. All of the plants, the animals. If we disappeared tomorrow, it wouldn't take too long to, for nature to undo all of the damage that we've caused.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, sorry, Martin.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing. Thank you so much. I thank you for those who stuck around, the panelists for sure, for sticking around and giving your time this evening. Just so much to think about. But one of the big questions I ask, just as you leave, this is more to think about. That's just what you need right now, isn't it? Is that while you're exploring all these, what does a reciprocal relationship look like to you, whether you're in the countryside, whether you're in the city? We often tend to the garden and we water it. That reciprocal relationship is pretty obvious and quite straightforward. When it comes to Mother Earth or climate change, what does that look like? That's what we really need to kind of search within ourselves. And hopefully some of these discussions in this series help you navigate that way. Grateful for the sharing, grateful for the different perspectives that are thrown, and basically trying to make this world a better place and something to take care of. everything was going to be from today is going to be recorded as well. So if you want to go and get some notes in there, as Molly alluded to, there was the Google form. That's kind of like for your reflection as well. But the things that we kind of like can learn from this as well can better place ourselves in doing more of this work and getting more people thinking about these things and more people caring. So thank you. Really appreciate it. You have a whole week off to ruminate on all these wonderful things, and then we'll be joining you again 7th of December, I think, in looking at kind of ways to care for the land. Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you.
Miigwech.
Miigwech, Kuyanamik.